In 1995, my sister Leia went to Camp High Pines and never came home. There was no body, no arrest, no real explanation. Just a long summer that ended in silence and a town that looked the other way. And for 30 years, I convinced myself that maybe it really was just an accident. Until the day I got the letter. No return address. Just my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. Inside was a single line from the sheriff's office: human remains had been found near the lake. And just like that, the silence was over. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Evelyn Walker. I'm 41 now, living in Indianapolis, working as a graphic designer for a small publishing firm. It's not a glamorous life, but it's steady. Quiet. I've never married. No kids. People used to ask why, and I'd smile and say I just liked having my own space. Truth is, part of me never left that summer. I kept it tucked away, the camp, the lake, the laughter before it all stopped. Kept it out of reach like a drawer I didn't open anymore. But that envelope, it brought it all back in an instant. I remember holding it in my apartment hands, shaking coffee growing cold beside me. It was just after 7:00 in the morning. I hadn't thought about Camp High Pines in years, not really, but the name still curled somewhere in the back of my mind like fog. The letter was short. It said the remains had been found near the western shoreline of the lake during a trail survey. The sheriff signed it. Nolan Ray. I didn't recognize the name, but I knew the weight behind his words. He didn't say Leia's name. He didn't have to. I sat there for a long time after that. The city noise outside, cars, footsteps, the whir of someone's blender upstairs, it all faded. The last time I saw my sister, she was barefoot, sunburned, laughing. 13 years old. She'd always been the brave one, the loud one. I was 10, tagging along behind her, just trying to keep up. And then one night she was gone. We never had a funeral. There was no body, no conclusive cause. Just a campfire vigil and a small plaque by the lake. After 2 weeks, my mom stopped saying her name. My dad disappeared into the garage. And when I told them I'd heard something screaming, I think they told me I was dreaming. I kept the old police report in a box on my bookshelf, along with a photo of me and Leia by the water. Our arms wrapped around each other. Her smile wide and wild, mine more careful. That was the last summer she was alive. By nightfall, I'd already packed a bag. I left a message for my manager, told her I was taking personal leave. I didn't ask. I just booked a one-way train back to Aerolite, the town I hadn't seen in 3 decades. It was almost dusk when I boarded. I remember the sound of the train pulling out of the station, low and distant, like something being torn away. I sat by the window and watched the skyline fall behind me, piece by piece. The further north we went, the more it felt like slipping back into an old room you'd locked up years ago. The air changed. So did the light. Aerolite hadn't changed much. The same narrow streets. The diner with the squeaky door. The gas station with the flag that never quite caught the wind. When I stepped out of the cab in front of my parents' house, the porch light wasn't on. My mom answered the door wearing the same cardigan she used to wear during chilly camp drop-offs. "You came," she said. "They found something," I told her. She stepped aside without a word. The house smelled like lavender and old wood polish. And something else. Something quieter. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence settling between us like it used to. I asked if she thought it was Leia. She didn't answer right away, just stared into her mug and said, "Some things are better left buried." I didn't argue. I'd heard that line too many times before. Later that afternoon, I walked to the sheriff's office. Officer Grace Bennett met me at the door. She was in her late 30s, tall, with a steady face that didn't give much away. She told me the remains were with the coroner in Fairview, DNA pending. But the place they were found, a shallow pit. No marker was only a quarter-mile from the old camp's western trail. I told her I wanted to see it. The drive out was quiet. We didn't speak much. The woods looked different than I remembered. Older, hungrier. The camp sign was still there, rotting tilted, nearly swallowed by ivy. Camp High Pines, established 1964. Bennett led me down a side trail. The cabins were falling in on themselves. The swing set creaked in the wind. The ground was damp. Near the lake, just past the rocks, the yellow tape fluttered between two trees. "That's where we found the remains," she said. I stared at the dirt. No gravestone, no cross, nothing. Whoever buried the body, she said, didn't want it to be found. I looked out at the lake. It was flat and still, like it had been waiting. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels expectant, like something's about to rise. The next morning started early. The sun was already high by the time I opened my eyes, though I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours. I woke up tangled in the old cotton sheets of my childhood bed, soaked in sweat like I'd been running from something in my sleep. And in a way I had. The dreams had been relentless snatches of trees and voices, Leia barefoot in the woods, a red-winged bird cutting across the sky, and a scream that never made it all the way out. But this time, there was something new. A voice, low and urgent. "Stay quiet, Evie. Don't move." It hit me like a jolt, not part of the dream, not invention. I'd heard those words before. The memory snapped in like a puzzle piece that had been missing for years. She had spoken to me that night. Downstairs, my mother was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table in slacks and a blouse like she was going to a luncheon that didn't exist. Her coffee sat untouched. The morning paper was folded perfectly, as if the world could still be kept neat. I poured a cup of coffee and sat across from her. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Then I looked at her and said, "We need to talk." She didn't look up. About what? About Leia. About what happened. There was a pause, just the soft tick of the wall clock behind her. "It's been 30 years, she said. "There's nothing left to say." But I remembered now. I'd seen her answer the phone that night. "You got a call," I said. "Late. After lights out. I saw you in the hallway. You told Dad it was a wrong number." Her hands curled tighter around her mug, but she didn't speak. "What did they say?" I asked. She looked at me then, and something in her eyes pulled tight. "They told me Leia had gotten into trouble, that she might try to leave camp. They said not to worry, that they'd keep her close, that she just needed discipline." My chest tightened. "You didn't tell the police?" She blinked hard. They were professionals. It sounded like it had been handled. "I didn't want to ruin her future. She was 13. I stood up fast enough to push the chair back across the tile. "You buried her while she was still alive. We thought we were doing the right thing. No. You thought silence was easier." I didn't wait for a response. I left the coffee, the table, the old house full of too many locked doors. Outside, the screen door banged behind me, and I kept walking until I reached the car. I drove without thinking. Just let the road take me. The trees were starting to shift into fall, and the edges of the maples were already bleeding yellow. I parked near the woods not far from the old trail that led to the lake, the same one we used to take with our flashlights and bug spray, pretending it was an adventure. I followed it now with heavier steps, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. The woods felt quieter than I remembered, like the air itself was holding its breath. I reached the clearing near Cabin B, the same small opening between the trees where you could see a sliver of water through the branches. I stood still, listening. And then, like something tearing through the dark, it hit me all at once. A door swinging open. Light from a flashlight. Leia's whisper. I have to go. Don't say anything. And me, 10 years old, frozen under my blanket, holding my breath. Then another voice. Male. Calm but wrong. Coaxing. Footsteps. And then the sound of something being dragged. My knees gave out and I caught myself against the base of a tree. I stayed there for a long time, doubled over, hands pressed to my mouth. The memory had never been gone. I had buried it, just like everyone else. But I heard her. She told me to stay quiet, and I did. I stayed quiet for 30 years. That night I left a voicemail for Officer Bennett. I don't even remember dialing. I just remember my voice shaking, trying to get the words out. I remembered something I told her. It's not evidence, but it's something. Leia didn't just run. She was followed. She told me not to speak, and I didn't. I'm sorry I didn't. And then I said it out loud for the first time since I was a child. Leia, I'm so sorry. I hear you now. I promise I won't stay quiet anymore. The next morning, I walked into the sheriff's office with a folder under my arm. Copies of everything I'd found background on Daniel Travers, the bird tattoo, the youth program he used to work for, which had been shut down after a wave of abuse allegations in the 90s. I handed the file to Bennett. She looked exhausted but focused. You okay? She asked. I shook my head. No, but I'm ready. We sat in the back office and spread the papers out across the table. She read through the pages, slowly flipping back once or twice to double-check something. The director's log, she said, finally pointing to the photocopy. This entry, she knows, we need to act. This is the date before she disappeared. July 14th, I said. She was gone the next morning. Bennett leaned back in her chair, arms folded. And you're sure about the identity Travers went by Travis that summer? He had a bird tattoo, red wings, left forearm, same as the insignia from the group he worked with. That tattoo was in at least 3 witness statements from former campers. You ran all this yourself? She asked. Someone had to. She didn't argue. I'll file a motion today to reopen the case, officially this time. I'll also request a subpoena Alias's credit history travel records. If he's out there, we'll find him. That afternoon, I sat in the town library, flipping through a dusty binder of staff names from 1995. I crossed out the ones I knew, people who had already been interviewed, counselors who gave statements. And then I saw a name I didn't recognize. Leonard D. Hale, temporary, Assistant Activities Coordinator. Something about it stuck. I ran the name through a few public record databases. Nothing. But when I narrowed it, Leonard D. Hale Aerolite, 1995, I found it. A court record buried deep in a scanned document from 1997, charged under a different name. Identity fraud, obstruction. A known associate of Daniel Travers. Never convicted. Never followed up on. Just another ghost in the system. That night, my phone rang. It was Bennett. I found something she said. Travers resurfaced in Arizona. New name, Andrew Lark. Volunteering at a wildlife sanctuary. Off the books, but we've got his last known address. Feds are looped in. I didn't speak for a moment. Is he alive? We believe so, but we'll need more than a tape and a name to bring him in. I told her about Leonard Hale. He was working that summer, too. There was silence on the other end. We never interviewed anyone by that name, she said quietly. Exactly. The next morning, I sat down in the station to give my full statement. I told them everything I could remember, what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I now knew had been buried deep in my memory. I handed over the pages from the camp log. Jared's statement, Maya's VHS tapes, Tasha's account. I watched it all become evidence, something real, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And when the officer at the end asked if there was anything else I wanted to add, I didn't hesitate. I want to know where my sister's body was for 30 years, I said. and why no one cared until now. When I stepped outside, Bennett met me at the curb. Her voice was quiet. "You did good." I shook my head. "I didn't do it for me. I know." She handed me a manila envelope. "The coroner's report." I didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths I've learned take longer to hold. The sky was beginning to dim when I got back to the house. I stood in the driveway a long time before going inside. Because even though everything was changing now, official investigations, federal agents, names finally being spoken, something about the way the light bent across the trees told me this wasn't over, not even close. Somewhere out there, someone still hadn't been found, and someone else had never truly left. The newspaper arrived the next morning, rubber-banded and damp from the dew. I picked it up from the front steps and set it aside without opening it. I already knew what it would say. Not in detail, not yet, but I knew the headline would read something cautious, something that wouldn't stir the town too much. I wasn't sure what I wanted it to say, but it didn't matter. No words printed in black and white would ever sound as loud as the silence had for all those years. I made a second cup of coffee and walked it out to the porch. My mother had already left for the store or for errands or maybe just to avoid me. I didn't ask anymore. The copy of the coroner's report still sat unopened on the kitchen table. I wasn't ready to read it, not yet. I knew what it would confirm. I just wasn't sure if I was ready to see it spelled out. Instead, I drove to the edge of town, past the diner, past the gas station with the crooked flag, and pulled into the gravel lot behind the library. I'd arranged to meet someone that afternoon, someone I remembered but only faintly. Jared Whitley. He'd been a camper that same summer, a little older than me, quiet, always writing in a spiral notebook he kept tucked under his arm. I'd found his name through a local alumni group. He taught 4th grade, now just one county over. I'd messaged him the night before, unsure if I'd even hear back. But he responded in less than an hour. I've waited a long time for someone to ask me that he'd written. We met at a small cafe off Route 6. Jared looked older than the photo on his school's website. Hair-thinning lines around his eyes, but when he stood up and said my name, I saw the boy he used to be still there, just quieter now. We sat in the back booth. I didn't order anything. He got black coffee, no cream, no sugar. "I remember you," he said. "And I remember her." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. "I don't talk about that summer," he said. "Not because I forgot. Because no one ever wanted to hear it." I leaned in slightly. "Why did you say yes now?" "Because I was there that night." He stared into his cup. "I saw her. He told me he'd gotten up to use the bathroom, said he couldn't sleep the way the woods sounded too still some nights. Said he saw Leia slipping out the back of cabin B, said she looked upset, angry even. She was walking fast, her fists clenched, and there was someone behind her. "Travis?" he said. My heart stopped. "You knew him?" "Everyone knew him," Jared said. "But no one really knew who he was. He wasn't on staff, not officially, never at roll call. But he was always around. Fixing things. Helping out. Hanging too close to the kids. I asked if he ever told anyone. I told my counselor the next morning. He said, his voice tightening. He laughed. Said I must have dreamed it. Told me not to go scaring people with stories. Jared didn't look angry when he said it. Just tired. I was 12, he added, and by the time I realized it mattered. The case was cold. That sentence stayed with me long after we said goodbye. I drove straight to the next meeting, this one arranged by Maya, a woman named Tasha Ellison. She'd been a camper too, one cabin over from us. Maya had stayed in touch with a few former kids over the years, tried to check in. Tasha had agreed to speak to me, but only at a halfway house in the next town over. She met me in the common room wearing long sleeves, even though it was warm inside. She looked older than her age, not by years, by weight. She sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a long time, just watched me. "I didn't think anyone would ever ask about that summer again," she finally said. Her voice was rough but clear. I asked what she remembered about Leia. She knew something, she said. That last week she was different. Not scared. Just watching everything. Quiet, but focused. She kept saying she was going to tell her mom something as soon as she got home. Tell her what I asked. Tasha looked down at her hands. There was a girl who left camp early, real shy. No one knew her well. People said she got homesick, that her parents came and picked her up. But she shook her head. I don't think anyone ever came for her. She paused for a long moment, then added, I think Leia saw something, and I think Travis knew it. I asked if she remembered his full name. She shook her head. No one ever called him anything but Travis, but he had a tattoo. Here. She tapped her left forearm. Bird with red wings. I still see it sometimes. In dreams. I wrote the description down as she spoke, careful to get the angle of the wings and the body right. It matched what I'd already found. That insignia red-winged bird belonged to a youth rehab group that operated through the early 90s. Crimson Rise, shut down after lawsuits, allegations of abuse, most of the details buried under NDAs, a handful of arrests, and one staff member listed in those records matched the man in the VHS tape. Alias, Travis Lakewood. Legal name, Daniel Trevors. It wasn't just a match. It was a confirmation. But confirmation wasn't enough. I needed something more. Something someone couldn't explain away. The next morning, I found it. It came from an old court record, just a single line buried in a financial disclosure. Gerald Howard Grady, formerly of Camp High Pines, filed for bankruptcy July 1996. It gave me an address, Pine Grove Lane, a white house with plastic siding and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. It looked more like a hospice than a home. A woman in scrubs answered the door. I told her my name, that I was a former camper, that I wanted 5 minutes. She looked me over carefully, then stepped aside. Make it quick. Inside, it smelled like antiseptic and something fainter underneath, like time that had settled in the walls. Grady looked nothing like I remembered. Frail, gray-skinned, eyes cloudy. He stared at the ceiling when I entered unmoving. Mr. Grady, I said, do you remember Camp High Pines? No response. Do you remember the summer of '95, my sister, Leia Walker, disappeared that July? Still nothing. Then, barely audible, he muttered something. I stepped closer. What did you say? Too loud, he whispered. They always knew too much. My stomach turned. I asked again. Who are you protecting? Who is Travis? He repeated the same phrase over and over. We had to. We had to. The nurse stepped into the doorway, arms crossed. That's enough for today. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A wooden box on a dresser, initials burned into the lid, GHG. Does he keep things in there, I asked. Old camp stuff, she said. Nothing important. She turned her back for just a second. That was all I needed. An hour later, I sat at my parents' dining table with the box open in front of me. Inside, photos, name tags, a few rosters, and a leather-bound logbook. It was the same one from the director's office. Yellowed, ink fading. Most of it was ordinary supply checklists, reminders, meal schedules. But near the back, the entries changed. July 10th. Disciplinary issues with L. Walker. Refusing curfew. Accusations against staff. July 12th. Confrontation with TL. Witnessed by camper. Needs to be addressed before pickup. July 14th. She knows. We need to act. The next entry was blank. She disappeared July 15th. I photocopied every page, then tucked the originals back in place. By nightfall, I was waiting outside the sheriff's office. When Bennett stepped out of her cruiser, I handed her the copies without a word. She read them slowly under the orange glow of the street lamp. And when she looked back at me, her voice was steady. "This is it." I didn't say anything. We both knew what came next. The hardest part about bringing something buried into the light is that once it's exposed, there's no way to put it back. No way to unsee it, unhear it, or pretend like it didn't change everything. That night, after handing Bennett the director's logbook copies, I didn't go home. I drove around for over an hour back roads and stretches of highway I hadn't taken in years. It wasn't about avoiding anything, it just didn't feel right to be in a house where the silence had grown so comfortable. So I pulled off near one of the smaller parks just outside town, sat on a bench under a flickering street lamp with the engine still ticking as it cooled behind me. For the first time in years, my head wasn't full of questions. It was full of names, dates, fragments that were starting to take shape. I'd wanted the truth. I just hadn't understood how heavy it would be once it started arriving. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and found my mother already dressed again like she was heading somewhere important. She wasn't. The same paper from the day before still sat folded by her plate. She hadn't touched it. I poured a cup of coffee and sat across from her without saying anything. We sat like that for a while. Then I asked her if she remembered the phone call, the one from the camp. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her mug, but she didn't answer right away. Eventually, she said she did. "They told me Leia was being difficult," she said. That she'd said some things about a counselor, that it wasn't true, that she needed boundaries, not trouble, and that they would handle it. Her voice was even, but I could hear something fraying at the edges. I didn't want it to ruin her. That's what they said, it could ruin her. I nodded. I didn't tell her that those words had been used before. I didn't say out loud how many times "it'll ruin them" had been used to bury something that should have been spoken. Instead, I asked why she didn't tell the police after Leia disappeared. She looked at me then, and her eyes were tired. Because I thought they already knew. I thought they would say it was my fault, that I didn't protect her. And maybe I didn't. She stood and left the room after that. And I didn't follow. I spent the rest of that day going through my box again, the one I'd carried since the first letter arrived. I had printed statements, now maps, names. Still no official file on Trevor's. Still no direct line between him and what had happened that night. But I was close. The tape Maya gave me kept playing in my head. Leia standing in that clearing, her body language sharp and defensive, Travis stepping toward her like he wasn't just angry but practiced. Someone who'd done this before. Someone who knew how to make it look like nothing at all. I replayed that section so many times I started noticing things I hadn't seen before. A flash of light in the background. Maybe a reflection from the lake. Maybe another flashlight. I wasn't sure, but something about it stayed with me. That afternoon, I drove back to the lake. Not the old trailhead the long way in the road the maintenance staff used. I hadn't taken it since I was a kid, but it was still passable. Leaves crackled under the tires, branches brushed the sides of the car. When I reached the old camp clearing, I parked and walked. The cabins looked even worse in daylight. Sagging roofs, hollow windows, vines threading their way through broken floorboards. I didn't go inside this time. I walked straight to the dock. The water was calm again, no wind, just the faint lapping against the rocks. I sat at the edge, same spot as always, photo still folded in my coat pocket. And I let myself listen. Not for answers, not for some dramatic sign, just for space. And it's strange, but I could still hear her laugh in the distance, not like a memory. Like something caught in the shape of the wind, only you can't quite hold it. I didn't realize someone had joined me until I heard the crunch of shoes behind me. Maya. She sat next to me without saying anything at first. Just handed me a thermos. "Peppermint," she said. "I figured you could use something warm." We drank in silence for a while. Then she said, "It was never just one person." I looked over. She was still staring out at the water. Travis wasn't the only one. There were others. Some of them knew. Some of them helped cover it. I never had proof. But there were whispers. Things I saw. Things I should have done something about but didn't know how. Her voice was steady. Not emotionless, just quiet. She told me about the counselors that summer. How many were new. How a few staffers showed up late, no background checks, no ID copies on file, just names written in marker on sign-in sheets, and how quickly some of those names disappeared once the season ended. Back at her place, she let me dig through her old bin again. We sat cross-legged on the floor, going through faded staff shirts, leftover rosters, photos curled at the edges. I found one taken during the staff orientation week. The group was standing in front of the dining hall. Most faces looked familiar, but one didn't. A tall man off to the side, face slightly turned, hands in his pockets. The name tag clipped to his shirt read Leonard. I showed it to Maya. "That's him," she said. "He went by Leonard Hale, helped with activities, barely spoke to anyone. But he was always near the younger cabins." I scanned the photo again. "I found a record," I said. "He was later arrested under a different name, Dennis Crowley, known associate of Daniel Trevor's, never charged in connection with the camp. But he was there." Maya leaned back against the wall. "So it wasn't just Leia," she said. I shook my head. "I don't think it ever was." That night I sat in my car outside the sheriff's office again. Bennett wasn't in yet. Her cruiser was still out on patrol. But the light was on inside. I left the photo in an envelope at the front desk with a note. "We need to find Crowley," I wrote. "He was there, and I think he still knows where the rest of the story is buried." Then I drove home, but I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom going through every page of the logbook copies again. Not reading, just looking, letting the pages tell me what the silence had hidden. And sometime before dawn, I found it. A small penciled mark in the bottom corner of the final entry. Not a full word, just a number. C4. I flipped through the attached map of the camp. Cabin C Section 4, an old supply shed used mostly for canoes and ropes. It had been locked the summer I was there. No one went in. I hadn't thought about it in years, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about that number had been left for someone, not just for record-keeping, a breadcrumb. I sat up straighter, the sound of the early morning wind pushing against the house, and I knew exactly where I'd be going next. The number C4 stayed with me through the night. I saw it every time I closed my eyes, drawn in faint pencil beneath that final logbook entry like a quiet afterthought. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even underlined, but it was deliberate. Grady's handwriting had been neat and measured throughout the book except for that last week when the entries turned clipped colder. Whatever C4 referred to it had mattered enough to be recorded on the same day Leia vanished. I waited until sunrise, then packed a flashlight, gloves, and my old file folder just in case someone asked why I was out there. I didn't tell my parents where I was going. I figured by now they could guess. The maintenance road to the back side of Camp High Pines had grown narrower since the last time I took it. Overgrown brush scraped against the car branches, cracked under the tires. I parked where the gravel turned to dirt and made the rest of the walk on foot. Cabin C was still there. Tilted slightly forward, its roof caved in at one corner like it had been trying to give up for years. The path behind it was almost invisible now, just a thin impression in the tall grass, but it led straight to the old equipment shed. I stood there for a moment before reaching for the latch. The shed door was padlocked, but the wood around it had rotted enough to make the lock pointless. I pried it open slowly, the metal groaning on rusted hinges. Inside it smelled like dust and mildew layered thick with years of closed-in air. Rope coils hung on hooks. Canoe paddles were stacked unevenly along the back wall, and in the corner, just barely visible in the low light, was an old metal filing cabinet. The drawers were stiff, the handles corroded. I had to brace myself to get the top one open. Inside were several plastic folders, some labeled by date, others by camper name. Most of them were blank forms, medical releases, attendance sheets. But near the back, tucked between two loose clipboards, I found a brown envelope sealed with brittle tape. On the front, Incident July 1995. I didn't open it there. I took it and backed out into the light, blinking as my eyes adjusted. I sat down on the cement block just outside the shed and peeled the flap open carefully. Inside were 4 pages and a photograph. The pages weren't official reports. They looked like handwritten notes, someone trying to get their version down before it slipped away. The handwriting wasn't Grady's. I recognized that instantly. These notes were messier, sharper, a different tone. The first page started with a name, Travis, real name unknown. Observed approaching campers during unscheduled times. Seen with L. Walker multiple occasions. It went on to describe a series of warnings given by another staff member name not listed, saying they had expressed concern to Grady twice but were told not to disrupt the chain of command. The second page was harder to read. It mentioned unauthorized nighttime contact and something called corrective exposure. That phrase didn't appear anywhere in the official materials I'd seen, but it was underlined and it appeared 3 more times in the following paragraphs. The photo was blurry, taken from a distance. It showed 2 figures near the tree line, the lake just visible behind them. The smaller figure I was almost sure was Laya. The taller one, facing away, had short, light-colored hair and stood with his hands on his hips. The timestamp in the bottom corner read July 13th, 1995, 2 days before she disappeared. I folded everything back into the envelope and sat there for a while, holding it in my lap. A bird called out from somewhere deeper in the woods, sharp and sudden, then went quiet again. When I brought the folder to the sheriff's office later that morning, Bennett met me in the back. She read the notes slowly, not reacting much, just underlining certain parts with her pen. She didn't say anything until she reached the last page. Then she looked up. "This is a witness," she said, "not a camper. Probably another staff member." I nodded. Whoever wrote it, they knew enough to be scared. We'll scan it, run the handwriting against the other reports from that year. If we can match it to a counselor who vanished after the season, it might explain why. I pulled out the photograph. "That's Laya," I said quietly. Bennett studied it for a long moment. "Where'd you find this cabin C? Filing cabinet in the back shed?" She looked at me like she already knew the next part. "It was supposed to be locked." "It was," I said, "but not enough." Later that day she called and said the documents had been verified and filed into the case, that they were enough to request an expanded background search on Grady's hiring practices that summer, especially the use of off-book volunteers. We both knew what that meant. They were building something. Not just a theory anymore. Back at home, I sat at the dining room table and started going through the staff list again. I didn't know what I was looking for, not exactly. But one name kept pulling at me. It wasn't because I remembered the person it was, because I didn't. And neither did anyone else. Listed as a junior counselor, T. Lakewood. No first name, just an initial. I flipped through the old binder from Maya's bin, cross-referenced the orientation photo, and there he was again, back row, off to the side. Same guy from the VHS. Same bird tattoo, just barely visible under his sleeve. The name he'd used that summer wasn't even a full alias. It was a placeholder. A patch. Something meant to fade the second the season ended. I wrote it all down and brought it to Bennett that evening. She didn't say much, just took it, nodded, and added it to the wall already filling up in her office. "We're getting close," she said. "How close?" I asked. "Close enough that if he's still alive, he's going to feel it soon." The next morning I got up early. It was still dark outside, but I couldn't sleep. I made coffee and sat on the porch, the air heavy with dew. Across the yard, the sun was just starting to push through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet, like the town knew something was shifting. I checked my phone. A single message from Bennett. "Call me when you're up." I found something. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I was afraid, because I already knew. Whatever came next wasn't going to be the end. It was only going to get darker, but it was finally going to be honest. I called Bennett just after 6. She picked up on the second ring already in her car, judging by the soft clatter of turn signals and road noise behind her voice. She didn't waste time. Said the federal database had matched 2 aliases connected to Daniel Trevors, one tied to a youth mentorship program in Utah, the other to a church-run summer retreat in Louisiana. Both listed him as a transport coordinator, a vague enough title to avoid background checks. I wrote it down while she talked, the pen unsteady in my hand. Neither place kept records longer than a decade. No official complaints, no court filings. But Bennett said that didn't mean nothing happened. It just meant no one made it stick. I asked if there were any active addresses. She paused, then told me they had him narrowed to a residence outside Flagstaff. Arizona DMV showed a renewal under the name Andrew Lark. Same birth date, same physical description. She told me the U.S. Marshals had already been briefed. If he ran, they'd know. If he stayed, they'd come. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. I don't think I was waiting for anything. I just didn't know what to do next. By noon, I was back at the station. The shed documents, the photo from 1995, the witness notes, everything had been scanned and filed. Bennett brought me into the back again and slid a slim envelope across the table. It was the final coroner's report, still sealed. She didn't push me to open it, just said, "When you're ready." I nodded and placed it in my bag. I still wasn't. We spent the next hour going through the timeline, revising staff logs, plotting when Travis or Trevors or Lakewood had first shown up that summer. I gave her the entry from the camp map C4 and told her how I'd found the envelope in the shed. She didn't question the details, didn't ask how I knew where to look. She just listened and kept taking notes. When I mentioned the phrase corrective exposure, she frowned and said she'd seen something like that once in a training manual from an old behavioral camp out west. The method was supposed to retrain defiance through isolation and repetition. I asked if that meant punishment. She said yes, but wrapped in protocol. On paper, it would look like a lesson plan, but in reality, it was something else. That afternoon, I stopped by Maya's. I hadn't told her yet about the shed or the photo or the notes. She answered the door holding a cup of tea and stepped aside before I could knock. "You look like someone who's been breathing underwater," she said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just followed her inside. Her living room smelled like cedar and peppermint, same as always. We sat on the floor again, same rug, same scattered bins of old camp materials between us. I handed her the envelope from the shed. She opened it slowly with the kind of care you'd use unsealing a letter from a version of yourself you'd tried to forget. She stared at the photo for a long time, then said, "That's her." I nodded. 2 days before. Maya didn't cry. She didn't speak for a while either. Then she said something I hadn't expected. There was a girl that year, she said, still looking at the image. She was younger, shy, barely spoke. I remember Leia sitting with her one night during a fire drill. No one else noticed. I only remember because she gave the girl her hoodie when the wind picked up. I asked what happened to the girl. Maya shook her head. They said she left early, got homesick, but no one ever saw a car. No one saw her go. She stood and walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a roster from July 1995. Camper names, arrival dates, assigned cabins. At the bottom was a single cross-out Ellis Grace departed early. I asked if there was a file on her. Maya said no. just the crossed-out name and a blank space where the parent signature should have been. Later that night, I drove back out to the cemetery. The stone with Laya's name on it was still there, flat, gray granite, no flowers. I sat beside it and watched the light fade between the trees. I didn't talk. I didn't bring the photo, just sat with the weight of it. The next morning, Bennett called again. Said the feds had confirmed it. Travers was alive, living quietly, no criminal activity under the new name. Low profile, rent paid in cash, volunteer work. But the tattoos matched. So did the dental records from his old arrest. She said it softly. "We have enough." I asked if they'd bring him in. She said a warrant was being signed that day. That same evening, I met with Jared and Tasha at the town library. Bennett had arranged for us to use one of the small conference rooms, the kind they used for book clubs and summer reading programs. It still smelled like old pages and carpet glue. Tasha had a notebook in her hands, already half full. Jared brought a folder, each tab labeled with names. Some I recognized, some I didn't. We sat at the table, none of us really sure how to start. Then Tasha said, "There are others, right?" I nodded. Probably more than we'll ever know. Jared flipped open his folder and pulled out a list. 7 names, former campers, all left early, no forwarding contact. I remember faces, he said, but no one ever talked about them again. We spent 2 hours going through what we could find. Phone numbers, last known addresses. A few names had been changed. One was now listed as deceased. Another lived 3 states away. Tasha told us she'd always wondered about one girl in particular, a camper named Michelle who'd refused to speak after her last night at the camp. She'd been withdrawn, bruised, kept apart from the others. But nothing was ever reported. No one even asked. When we finished for the night, we stood in the parking lot under the flickering security light. Tasha looked up at me and said, "We're not just uncovering a death. We're uncovering a system." I told her she was right. Then I got in my car and drove home, the road dark and narrow, headlights casting long shadows through the trees. When I got home, the envelope from Bennett was still sitting on the table. I picked it up, weighed it in my hands, and finally opened it. I read every line of the coroner's report, slowly, carefully. The cause of death had been listed as sedative overdose, toxic levels, small body, underdeveloped system, unmonitored. The report noted shallow burial post-mortem movement and traces of soil consistent with lakeside sediment. And beneath all of that, a single sentence, death determined non-accidental. I folded the report and placed it back in the envelope. Then I stood at the window and looked out across the yard, watching the wind press against the trees like something still hiding there. Something that had waited all this time to be seen. Something that was about to be. He didn't put up a fight. That's what Bennett told me when she called just after noon. They'd taken him outside of Flagstaff at a small rental cabin tucked behind a gravel access road. No weapons, no aliases on hand, no visible signs of panic. Just a man who already knew the knock was coming. She said he looked thinner than the photo, more gray in the beard. Still had the bird tattoo. They brought him in under the name Daniel Travers, but he answered to the alias Andrew Lark, like he'd been living it so long he forgot it was borrowed. I didn't ask if he said Laya's name. I didn't want to hear it from him first. The news broke that evening. Just a 2-line update on the station's website: former Camp High Pines counselor arrested in connection with 1995 disappearance. There was no photo, no details, just a quiet confirmation that what we remembered, what we feared, hadn't been imagined. I went for a walk around the lake that night. Same path we used to take during fire drills and late-night kitchen raids. The water was still, glass flat. I watched the moon reflect off the surface and thought about how many kids had stood there skipping stones or whispering secrets, not knowing what had happened on the other side of the trees. The next morning, Bennett let me sit in on the interview. Not officially. I wasn't in the room. but she let me watch the video feed from a private monitor tucked in the back of the sheriff's office. The room was bare, just a table, 2 chairs, and a pitcher of water. Travers sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him. No cuffs, no visible emotion. His eyes stayed fixed on the corner of the table like the camera wasn't there, like he'd done this before. He didn't deny knowing Leia. Didn't deny being at Camp High Pines. What he did was worse. He talked around it. Referred to the program, to methods of correction, to behavioral restructuring. Said those terms like they were medical, like they'd been cleared by experts. When Bennett asked directly about the last day she was seen, his voice stayed even. She wasn't following instructions, he said. She needed to be reminded. Bennett pressed him. Reminded of what? Where was she taken? What did he give her? He didn't blink, just enough to help her sleep. She was anxious. When she asked if he buried her, he didn't answer, just stared down at the table and said, "It was never supposed to be that deep." I stepped away after that, went outside. The air was cold, but clear. I stood in the parking lot and let the silence settle. He had said it not in so many words, but enough. Enough to know the truth had been waiting under that lake bed for decades. Later that afternoon, Bennett and I went back to the camp one more time, this time with permission. She had the key to the old office. We walked through the back hallway, the paneling warped with age, the floor creaking with every step. She opened the filing room, and there, behind a false wall panel, they found the second drawer. Not part of the camp's original structure. A hidden cavity built into the wall no bigger than a suitcase. Inside were dozens of paper files, faded manila folders, each labeled with a first name, an intake date, a cabin number. Most of the names were girls. One folder marked G. Ellis contained a single page, a medication log. No diagnosis, no parent signature, just initials and dosage levels. Another marked M. Carter listed 5 consecutive infractions and the words "discipline required" in red ink. No staff initials, no witness signatures, just that phrase over and over. We collected everything, logged it, photographed every page before sealing the room with evidence tape. Bennett didn't speak much during the process. I think we were both holding the same truth in our hands and trying not to let it break us. This wasn't just about one child. It never was. The next day, a former counselor from the '94 season came forward after hearing about the arrest. She lived 3 towns over and had never spoken publicly. Said she remembered the man not by name, but by his hands. Said he always kept them clean. Carried a small bottle of sanitizer before it was common. Said he was overly polite to the senior staff, but had a way of closing in when he got frustrated with the younger girls. She remembered Leia, too. Called her the one who asked too many questions. Said that was the last thing she heard before Leia was pulled from the craft lodge and reassigned to lake duty. That counselor had written a report at the time. Said it disappeared from the office the next morning. She quit 2 days later. Never came back. By the end of the week, the FBI had officially joined the investigation. Not just for the files, but because other names were beginning to surface. Other camps, other missing records. They issued a press release with a number to call for former campers. Maya printed it and hung it in the window of the bookstore right next to the staff photo from 1995. She didn't say anything when she did it, just nodded when I looked at her. That night I went back to the lake. Same bench, same clearing. This time I brought the camp photo with me. Sat there in the dark, the paper crinkled at the corners from how often I'd folded it, traced it, studied it. I looked at each face one by one. Some I still knew. Some I'd only come to know through loss. But each of them had been there that summer. Each of them had walked the same trails, eaten the same dinners, heard the same lies about who to trust. And now, finally, someone was listening. Someone had been heard. In the quiet, I heard a sound, soft, steady. Not wind, not animals. just the hum of distant tires on a road not far enough away. For a moment, I wondered if someone else was out there, watching, remembering, or maybe just waiting for the part where it all came apart. Because it had. And now, piece by piece, it was being put into the light. The indictment was filed on a Thursday. 4 counts, 1 for unlawful disposal of a body, 1 for obstruction, and 2 for criminal negligence resulting in death. Bennett called me before the press got wind of it. Said the charges weren't enough, but they were solid. The state needed something they could prosecute cleanly. I asked about the timeline. She said preliminary hearings would begin in 3 weeks, but the feds were holding him without bail. Too much risk of flight, too many aliases, and still no known relatives. He hadn't requested a lawyer. Just sat there, she said, quiet as ever, answering only when prompted. When I asked if he'd mentioned Grace Ellis, she hesitated, then told me he had. Just once. Said she couldn't adjust. That was the phrase he used. Like the child had failed a class. By then, word had started to spread beyond town. Articles popped up, quiet background pieces. Mostly local press and a few regional crime blogs. None of the names were released publicly, not yet, but enough was written between the lines that people started connecting dots. Jared called me 2 nights later. Said a woman from Colorado had reached out, said she'd been at Camp High Pines the summer of '95. Her name was Camille, and she remembered the night of the blackout. Said she'd woken up during it, heard movement outside the cabins, footsteps on gravel. She'd told a counselor the next morning, but no one followed up. No one took notes. Camille never went back. We arranged a call. She remembered Leah. Not well, but enough to describe her laugh, the bracelets she used to stack up her wrist. She remembered the necklace, too, the one with the glass bead. Said she'd seen it on the ground near the boathouse the morning after the storm. When she bent to pick it up, a counselor told her to leave it, said it was trash. That detail stuck with her. It wasn't trash, she said. I knew that even then. Camille agreed to write a statement. She'd kept a journal that summer. Tasha and I reviewed it together. The pages were sun-bleached, filled with little drawings and incomplete sentences, but the timeline matched, especially the part where she mentioned a girl who disappeared during breakfast roll call. Not missing, not kidnapped, just gone like her name had never been written down to begin with. That phrase haunted me. Not written down, not counted. Over the next week, more came in. 5 former campers, 2 ex-staff. One woman said her sister had worked in the kitchen and had always suspected something was going on, but was too scared to say anything. Said she heard screaming one night in August, muffled short, and then nothing. Another, a boy named Eli, remembered being told not to speak to certain girls. He was 10 then, didn't know why. Just knew the rules were different depending on which cabin you were assigned. The DA's office expanded the scope, added a second investigator to Bennett's team. The files from the hidden wall were being combed through, cross-checked with state databases, and when I asked how many names were flagged as incomplete departure, she said, "Too many." That was the exact phrase. Too many. But for all that was surfacing, there was still no formal charge for Leah's death. That required more. A confession or another witness or proof that she hadn't just overdosed accidentally. And then, in late April, something shifted. A retired nurse from Arizona contacted the state tip line. Said she'd worked at a residential facility in 1996 under a different name but same program, same corrective structure. Said a man had arrived one day with a girl who wouldn't speak. Thin, bruised, confused. She stayed 2 weeks, then disappeared from the records. The man had gone by Mr. Lark. She recognized the face in the paper, said she was ready to testify. With that, the DA filed an amendment, added 1 count of manslaughter tied to a minor in state-sanctioned care. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Bennett told me it was the crack they needed. The pretrial hearing was closed to the public, but I waited outside the courthouse. Maya came with me, so did Jared and Tasha. We didn't speak much, just stood under the overhang while the rain hit the sidewalk in long, steady sheets. When Bennett walked out 2 hours later, she nodded once. No words, just a look that said this part is moving forward now. That night I brought the roster home, the one with Grace's name crossed out but not erased. I pinned it next to the camp photo, not for display, just for memory. The kind that doesn't fade even when no one else believes it. The next morning, Maya called and asked if I'd heard the radio. I hadn't. She said a public station had aired a segment about ghost records in youth rehabilitation camps. They mentioned Camp High Pines by name, briefly, then moved on. But the audio cut off before the sponsor ad. The feed picked up again mid-song, and that was when it hit me. This was never just about one person, or one camp. This was a system built on silence, on paperwork designed to vanish on names left blank and voices never counted. And somehow some part of that system was still out there, not erased, just waiting. They never found Leia's body. That's the part I think most people struggle with, the absence of a grave, a marker, a place to set flowers. After everything that surfaced, all the files, all the testimony, all the pieces we pieced together, there's still that one question that never got answered. Where is she? Where was she left? The trial moved forward in stages. Some charges stuck, some didn't. The prosecution leaned heavily on the pattern, the hidden files, the contradictory reports, the witness statements from former campers. The nurse from Arizona testified via video. Her voice was calm, deliberate. She described the girl who wouldn't speak, the bruises, the silence around her transfer. She said she remembered the man most by how neat he was, every shirt pressed, every form initialed. In the end, he was convicted of unlawful disposal and obstruction. The more serious counts fell apart when the defense argued lack of physical evidence. No body, no confirmed time of death. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I sat through both. Not because I expected closure, but because I needed to be there. For her. For Grace. For the others who never made it home. He got 24 years, eligible for parole in 18. It wasn't enough. We all knew that. But it was more than we'd had for nearly 30. After the sentencing, a small group of us went back to the lake. Maya brought a bundle of daisies from the bookstore. Jared had made a wooden marker, just a simple piece of driftwood with Leia carved into the side. We placed it near the clearing by the water, not as a grave, but as a way to say someone remembers you. Someone fought for your name to be spoken again. The camp's property was eventually sold. Developers came in, started clearing the trails. A hiking resort, they said. Outdoor luxury. They left the dining hall untouched for now. A preservation group stepped and filed paperwork to mark it as a historic site. Not because of the crimes, but because of the memory. The complicated memory of what it had been for so many of us, safe and unsafe. Joyful and terrifying. Sometimes people ask me why I stayed so involved. Why I didn't just let it go once the arrest was made. I don't always have a clean answer. I think part of me was trying to make sense of something that couldn't be undone. But another part, maybe the bigger part, just didn't want her to be forgotten. That's what silence does. It erases. I don't live in town anymore. Moved about a year after the trial ended. But I keep in touch with the ones who stood beside me, Bennett, Maya, Tasha. Every now and then we meet for coffee or send each other a headline when another survivor speaks out. The stories are still coming. Other camps, other names. The system wasn't just broken. It was designed to vanish kids who didn't comply. And once you see that clearly, you don't stop looking. I keep the camp photo on my bookshelf. Not framed, just tucked behind a stack of paperbacks. It's bent at the corners now. Some of the ink is fading, but I can still make out her face. That half smile, like she knew something was funny but hadn't said it yet. I still hear her voice sometimes. Not in words, just the sound of it. The way she'd hum while making bracelets or sing off key on the trail hikes or whisper someone's nickname during flashlight tag. That's what stayed. Not just what happened, but who she was. If this story stayed with you, if you remember Leah now, even just by that one name, consider sharing it. Someone else might remember something, and maybe, just maybe, a name that's gone missing will finally find its way back.